It's been a long time coming. Take it to the streets. Hit control, delete. Take it to the streets. Hit control, delete. Take it to the streets. Hit control, delete. Take it to the streets.
Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, one of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going weekly video games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube. Back with another episode of the Games Memo. This is the Games Memo for Thursday, the 30th of July, 2026. So without much further ado, let's get to it. Got a lot of things to go over tonight. Probably going to be a pretty healthy, meaty, chunky, lengthy episode. So let's get started with Xbox. One of a few Xbox stories tonight. Xbox states discs should not fail during outages. We are looking into reports. This news story over on The Gamer by James Lucas. Okay, earlier this week, Xbox suffered from major network outages that prevented players not only from buying and downloading games, but playing them all together, even from a physical disc. In response, Chief Technology Officer Scott Van Vliet assured that entitlement checks should not prevent players from accessing their games, and that the team is looking into the matter. We're looking into reports that some players were unable to access games using discs as expected during the service interruption, Vliet said in a statement to The Verge. Disc-based entitlement checks should not prevent players from accessing their games, and this is by design. So just want to kind of go over my own thoughts on this topic. Microsoft has responded to reports that some Xbox players were unable to launch even physical disc-based games during a recent Xbox Live outage, acknowledging that this behavior was unintended. According to the company, consoles should have relied on locally cached licensing entitlements instead of requiring an online validation check. And Xbox says it is investigating the issue while preparing a software update to prevent it from happening again. What's particularly interesting, however, is that this is the second time in roughly the last 3 years that Microsoft has pointed to cached entitlement handling as part of the root cause for a major outage. That raises legitimate questions about the complexity of Xbox's licensing architecture, even if the immediate bug is ultimately straightforward to correct. What struck me most about the reaction to this story wasn't Microsoft's explanation, it was the familiar chorus claiming that this somehow proves physical media is inherently superior to digital distribution. And so now I'm starting to talk about the social media response to this. That conclusion simply doesn't hold up. People continue to conflate three completely different concepts: the storage medium, the delivery mechanism, and the licensing system. A Blu-ray disc, a downloaded game stored on an SSD, and virtually every other modern game installation are all just data written to physical storage. The real question isn't whether the installation files arrived on a disc or over the internet. The question is whether the game depends on online entitlement validation or server-side functionality to operate. If a game requires a Hello World check-in with a licensing service, or worse, relies on live server infrastructure or gameplay, even a physical disc cannot insulate you from a network outage. So there's a very big theme in kind of some of these concepts that I'm going over, and that's the problem I think that people have hyper-focused on is the whole delta between physical and digital, and that's really not the problem. The problem that has incurred that really caused the disruption that a lot of you are feeling isn't that the game is digital, that the delivery mechanism is digital. It's that you have a digital identity, and that every game on these systems, on Xbox and PlayStation, although there are deltas between the two, is incumbent upon that game and the entitlement to play that game on that system to be associated with an ID. That on some of these systems require the registration of that ID and the existence of that ID to exist in a system that you don't own and don't control. Xbox specifically requires you to have an email validated digital identity and account set up. There is a way to work around that. It is incredibly convoluted. PlayStation requires an ID, but there is a way to do that in a way that that ID remains local to the machine and doesn't have to exist within the PlayStation network services regime, that it's less convoluted than Xbox's implementation. Now, regardless, the point is that you have a digital identity and that has to be associated with the game. And so if that association with the game for that entitlement is enabled via network connectivity, then when the network goes down, that is what is impacted. It doesn't matter whether or not you have the installation file on the disk or whether or not you got the installation file delivered to you through the cloud. The problem is that its root is that a human being has to be associated with content, and the binding relationship for that association is the entitlement, which is what all of these licensing systems, authentication and authorization, a lot of digital things that we deal with in the ICAM and in the access management and access control world that you are now a part of. Let me catch up with the chat. Hero Down Under, good morning from down here. Hey, thanks a lot, Hero Down Under, for joining into the chat. I really appreciate it. I have a much longer lecture. I'll just call it a lecture on these topics that goes back through the history of video games and talks about how the control regimes have evolved through shareware and floppy disks and zip drives and all of these different licensing schemes, and how these things are all tethered into the notions of copyright, trademark, patent law, intellectual property protection, and how these things have existed all the time, and they've never been about making sure nobody compromises Neil Druckmann's game or Cory Barlog's game or Todd Howard's game. It's always been about a regime of control for the publisher, for the distributor. That includes all other types of media, including books. Friend of the channel, friend of mine, Ramon Terrell, will come through here and talk to you ad nauseum about what has happened, and he's an author, what has happened, a published author of science fiction and fantasy novels. And we'll talk about like all of the dealings and machinations that go along with this regime when you're working with Amazon as a publisher. So we won't go into all that depth of detail tonight, but there's a lot of things that people are getting confused and a lot of things that people are basing their arguments on that are incorrect. And my stance is not that I'm like against the people who want physical media. It's that the arguments you're basing, like the foundations for your arguments and your assertions, are just at an intellectual level just incorrect from a legal perspective, from an IP perspective, from a regulatory perspective. And they're also based on like a misunderstanding of, what it is that you have a copy of, right? You have a copy of an installation file, right? That unpacks and deploys from one media onto another. And that executable file gets associated with assets, with content assets. Sometimes, in some cases, that exist on a piece of physical media. But very, very often in the modern age, the entirety of the assets aren't on that physical media. The remainder of those assets are in the cloud, and you don't have any idea whether or not those assets are critical. You have no idea whether or not the physical media that you have actually contains critical path files that the code must traverse in order to make the game operable. You also don't know right? Because there's a lot of, well, what if this and what if that, and like, what if they remove access to your content, and I'm like, well, what if a meteor like impact, like there's a lot of worrywartism, and my thing is if you have the physical media, if you apply that same worrywartism, you don't know that an operating system update will hit your console and render your game inoperable unless your game gets an update, a patch, which you can't have unless it's connected to the internet. So there's just a lot of these arguments that have plot holes where they are not congruous and they are not holistic and they are not complete, right? Where they fall apart. But in particular, on this note of the outages, and this includes the PlayStation outage, which shortly preceded this, is this notion that, hey, if I have the game on physical media, I'm insulated, right? Because there was a lot of backslapping and rap gameism about, this shows the fallacy of the digital future, and this shows what can happen. And I'm like, as this thing points out, right, even if you have the physical media, you're not insulated from a network outage. And what people will say is, but Xbox acknowledges it's not supposed to work that way, and they're working on it. Here's the problem. They are talking about cached. They are saying that the way it is supposed to work is through cached entitlements. Cached, the technical definition of cached, means that it is ephemeral, that it has an expiration date, that it is perishable, that it does not last forever. And so, yes, even if you have a cached entitlement, the cached entitlement only exists for a period of time. Will probably be 90 days, is what I would assume, because that's kind of like a typical timing, right, in the space of ICAM and license entitlement and things of that nature. So you need to check in. So again, this disrupts the notion of complete and entire ownership, right? There are dependencies within a network-enabled world that are going to persist, whether or not software exists on physical, whether or not installation files are delivered via physical media or via the cloud, because they're both physical. An SSD is a physical memory storage device, right? It's just kind of weird that it's the difference way back in the day, right, is we used to talk about things as removable media versus permanent storage, right? But the SSD is still a physical device. So like I said, there's just kind of a lot of misconceptions and misperceived notions that are going on. Let's see. Hero Down Under says, I've sold off 27 disk-based games, 25 left to sell off, and my collection will become better curated. How do I spell Ramon's full name? I've been looking for his fantasy books. I will send it to you in the Discord when we get off of here, Hero. And I'll attach his Blue Sky address. D. Hoffer, this idea that Xbox should lean into physical nonsense, right? This is another kind of thing that I think is a bit of a fallacy. This notion that Xbox has the chance to undo PlayStation, right, based on PlayStation's misstep. Please understand that Xbox's sales of digital are at a higher percentage and ratio than PlayStation's are. PlayStation's are 80-20, 85-15. Xbox's are 91% digital. And as the primary platform owner that primarily has its foot in the PC world because they own it, they have inherently been part of the charge towards digital that pervaded on PC well before this discussion on console. So it is highly, highly, highly. Oh, by the way, they don't own the Blu-ray spec. They were the champions of the spec that lost, right? And so they pulled back from physical media even faster because we weren't doing HD DVD. So this notion that Project Helix is going to come with a disk drive and Microsoft is going to be the champion of physical, I mean, maybe, but we're going to talk later in the show about how just the entire notion of things that Xbox will try and the likelihood of them working is yet another conceptual fabric that has a lot of problems, right, when it's punched up against reality. And guys in the chat, I appreciate you guys coming through. If the music is too loud or something, please let me know, because in my ear it sounds fine, but sometimes the balance isn't what I think it is. Hero Down Under. No company wants physical, and if the AI bubble goes bust, these data centers will be rented for streaming, everything including gaming. The overbuild of data centers, if the AI bubble bursts, will be useful globally for good streaming. D. Hoffer says, PlayStation is taking the PR hit. Why would Xbox bite the hand that feeds it? Right. Hey, Priscilla, thanks so much for subbing through. I appreciate you. Okay, all right, thanks, Fox. I appreciate it. Okay, so let's go on with the analysis that I'd written up of this particular issue. This is why I think discussions surrounding both the recent Xbox outage and earlier PlayStation Network outages have missed the point. Modern gaming ecosystems are deeply integrated with online identity management, entitlement services, cloud infrastructure, and in some cases, server-hosted gameplay systems. Ubisoft's The Division 2 is a perfect example, which I love. The Division 2. It is one of my favorite games. I think I have in excess of 80 hours in that game right now. More if you count both my PC time and my PlayStation 5 time. So Ubisoft's Division 2 is a perfect example. Even if you're playing alone, portions of the game's functionality still rely on server-side systems. Whether you purchase that game digitally or on a physical disc becomes largely irrelevant once the game's architecture depends on online services. The same principle applies to platform licensing. When cached entitlements work correctly, offline play should continue uninterrupted for games that don't require server-side functionality. When they don't, both digital purchases and physical discs can be affected in exactly the same way. And even, as I mentioned, even with cached entitlements, cached by definition means it's not permanent, right? The cache eventually expires. And at that point, you are going to require a Hello World digital check-in, right? Entitlement validation. So none of this excuses Microsoft, or PlayStation for that matter. If anything, the recurrence of cached entitlement issues suggests that Xbox's licensing infrastructure may be more complicated and fragile than many people realize. As someone who works in the space, it is overly complicated and overly fragile, likely reflecting the company's extensive integration with Azure-based identity and entitlement systems. At the same time, I think the public conversation often exaggerates the scale of these outages. Over the last several years, we've seen only a handful of significant incidents measured against thousands of days of service. Five9's reliability still allows for occasional failures, and no cloud service offers 100% uptime. Rather than promising perfection, Microsoft, and Sony for that matter, would serve players better by demonstrating continuous investment in reliability. Quarterly engineering updates highlighting infrastructure improvements, capital investments, regional capacity expansions, DevOps, SRE initiatives that cite reliability engineering, or resiliency enhancements would do far more to build confidence than only communicating after an outage has already occurred. So let's loop back to a couple of things in that paragraph. All right, five nines. If you're not familiar with the term, five nines is something that we use in reliability engineering and systems engineering, in service engineering. And that is when you see 99999, that's five nines. When you see 99.9999, that's four nines, right? 3 nines, 2 nines. All those things matter, right? It's just yet another thing that people don't realize who are paying for stuff. And look, everything that I'm saying tonight, the vast majority of what I'm saying tonight on this topic is about when you pay for something. If you choose not to read, then you do not know what you are paying for. And that may be the cause of your surprise when you're not entitled to something that you think you're entitled to. When you sign up to Xbox Live or PlayStation Network, it has an SLA, a service level agreement, where they talk about what they assure you for uptime, right? And it is not 100%. So they are not obligated to keep the network up 100% of the time. And so the blips of outages that we've had, which has been like 2, maybe 3 over the last 3 years, are perfectly in line with that SLA, right? And when they are concerned that their blip has caused you some impact that has any risk of violating that SLA or them being sued about that SLA, you will get something for free. You will get some makeup. So I think these network outages are kind of par for the course. But again, because the internet is sensationalist and content creators are sensationalists and influencers are sensationalists, because your biggest content creators and influencers are highly reliant on being sensationalists and outrage baiters to monetize their channels. That is what gets surfaced on the internet, but it's not realistic by any means whatsoever. So, and so one of the things that I'm suggesting here is one of I think the PR problems with these events is Scott Van Vliet like piping up that they're going to work on this problem with Xbox Live. I'm like, you know what, Scott? Doesn't really fill me with a ton of confidence when literally the entire Xbox has an army of executives that are constantly running their mouths and blabbing literally every week. Like literally quite honestly, the last couple of weeks that I haven't podcasted and done the Games Memo has been for 2 reasons. One, because of this whole physical versus digital debate, which I think is a very difficult discussion for people to have with any civility, and any notion of like just simple basic human courtesy, because of all the emotion surrounded with it, has been one reason. But the other reason is because a lot of the news has been about Xbox, and it's about them saying nothing because they're constantly talking. So somebody who constantly talks, I can never understand how that person, like in general, the more you talk, the less meaningful your words are, and that's why you talk so much. So, but the news has been a ton of Xbox stuff that really hasn't been impactful or pertinent or objective or evidentiary. But like, so Xbox has an army of executives who are constantly blabbing their mouths. Scott Van Vliet, who yes recently rolled into his role, hasn't said a word, and the first time he says a word is when he has this network outage. Now, I will say, having been someone who's worked in network engineering and has been a network architect, and when I first got into networking as a hobby, I will tell you, networking as an IT discipline, as an IT domain, is one of the most thankless jobs to do in the world, and I have absolutely no interest and desire to do it. I did it as a I filled in as a network architect for a while when I was an enterprise architect, because the network architect had transferred and they were not going to backfill that person, because the role organizationally was kind of in question and in flux about whether or not it was going to be part of this organization or a larger corporate organization. And so while there was that dancing of the elephants going on, the lower organization that I was part of just intended not to backfill it. But like, that network architect had a job. Like, they had we had change orders we had to sign off on updates to the network, and the network was constantly evolving. And I'm like, well, we can't just stand around and have nobody sign it. So I filled in, and like I said, even when I got into home networking as a hobby, probably a decade before that, like one of my strict rules with family technical support, and I had to learn this, is that I do not provide networking support remotely, because I was on a call with a family member and they screwed something up and just completely lost all connectivity, and I was like, okay, that's and they weren't screen sharing, so I was like, yeah, I'm never doing that again. Like, I'm not troubleshooting somebody's network problem only verbally. So in general, I just don't do it at all now. It is one of the most thankless jobs, and it is one of a thankless job because nobody cares when the network working is your job. So nobody ever thanks you for that. They only care about you when the network's not working. And so nobody ever says thank you, but people give you tons of crap when it doesn't work. And I've worked similar jobs, being responsible for like HVAC and sewage and other stuff. And again, thankless jobs. Like, nobody cares. Nobody cares if they can take a shower that day. That's just you doing your job. But the moment the water's not available, right, then all of a sudden, right, you're the most popular person in a limited space. But my point is that if all the other Xbox executives constantly talk and yap their mouths about things that don't matter, then I think the network guy can maybe post something on his Twitter account, which apparently he's going to start using, like all the other Xbox executives do. Maybe once a quarter, say, hey, this quarter we did capacity increases right in the region that covers India, and we've onboarded we've brought in 5 new F5s to handle load balancing and quicker logins, right, and greater reliability in the region that covers the southern part of the U.S., right? You don't have to get super deep and super technical, but because here's what I think most consumers don't understand. Most consumers don't understand that probably in reality, you're probably always doing things to improve the reliability and resilience of the network every day. That's your job. A big part of your job is just keeping the lights on and making things work. But the other big part of your job is constantly improving, perfective maintenance. And I think most consumers don't understand that. So my personal feeling is, when something goes down and something bad happens and you start talking to me about how concerned you are, I'm kind of like, whatever, dude. Like, look, your crap's down, like, fix your crap, right? But if were a just slightly better drumbeat about communicating to people that we're always working on this stuff and we're always investing money and we're always, seeking talent and we're always getting training and new equipment, I think that would go just a little further than the conciliatory, what I feel kind of pandering tweet is that, oh, hey, this is because my problem is, like, the root cause you identified is literally the same root cause that you brought up 2 or 3 years ago when there was the big network outage. So I don't really care that hats changed and that like somebody different was doing the job. You're all Xbox. We're going to talk about that a little bit later tonight too. Let me catch up with the chat if I can. Might be too far behind. Oh, thanks so much, Innate, for coming through. Thousands of hours in Division 2. Okay. Let's see. I probably have a few more things here. Ultimately, I don't believe this incident strengthens the argument for physical media nearly as much as some commentators suggest. Instead, it highlights a broader reality about modern gaming. Ownership, licensing, authentication, and online infrastructure are now tightly intertwined, regardless of how the software was delivered. Physical disks are no longer a guarantee of complete independence from network services, just as digital purchases are not automatically at risk every time an outage occurs. When these outages occurred, you could, both PlayStation and Xbox, you could still play your digital games. What could you not do? If for some reason the game that you wanted to play wasn't actually installed on your SSD, you couldn't play it, right? Because you couldn't go and download it. But if you had the game installed, and if you weren't way out of periodicity of the entitlement validation, which is something that would also impact you if the game were physical, you could play your games. This had a network outage has nothing to do and no impact, no greater impact on you in a digital future than it does right while there's the existence of physical media. Outside of that edge case of you want to play a game that you don't physically have installed. And again, in a world of 5 nines and 4 nines, that is your SLA for what you pay for. If the once every 12 to 36 months that the network is unavailable for a period of greater than 8 hours, you can't access a game that you can't download. I don't know that that's as large of an impact as a lot of other content creators and influencers would have you believe. The lesson from this outage isn't that disks are the future or that digital distribution is broken. It's that platform holders must continue investing in resilient entitlement systems, transparent engineering practices, and robust offline functionality so that the rare network outage remains exactly what it should be, a temporary inconvenience rather than a defining characteristic of modern gaming. Yeah, right. Yeah, you can always open a book. Okay, let me grab a drink and let's go on to talk about the Valve Steam machine. Okay, this next news story over on Tom's Hardware. Valve says that Steam machine reservations won't be fulfilled until the end of this year. Company also releases CAD files for the PC console's external shell under Creative Commons. This news story over on Tom's Hardware by Joey Morales. Steam Machine fans who weren't lucky enough to get a chance to buy the console on its first drop will have to wait until as late as December 2026 to get it. Valve said in its update that the reservation queue varies between products and regions, meaning Valve is already going through the waitlist for some versions of the console in select areas. However, it seems that others would have to wait longer if they chose a particular popular trim of the Steam Machine in a region where there are many buyers too. We're fulfilling orders on a daily basis, sending out emails to reservation holders with the option to purchase in the order in which they landed on this list post-randomization. We expect everyone in the reservation queue will have the option to purchase by the end of this year, Valve said in its update. It also added with each reservation queue and a corresponding wait list being per product per region, they can move at different speeds based on demand. This means for some products in some regions, we've reached the end of the reservation queue and have started inviting folks from the wait list. Okay, let's talk through my assessment. Valve's latest update on the Steam Machine is being framed as good news. The company now expects to fulfill all current reservations by the end of 2026, while continuing to ramp production. On its face, that sounds like evidence of overwhelming demand, but I'm not convinced the reservation queue tells the whole story. A reservation is a low-cost expression of interest, not a purchase commitment. Some people join simply to watch how the process unfolds, others are waiting to see whether pricing changes, and the existence of Steam machines already appearing for resale above MSRP on eBay strongly suggests that scalpers are participating as well. That doesn't mean demand isn't real. It simply means the reservation queue is an imperfect measure of genuine consumer demand. The pricing reinforces that skepticism. Unlike the Steam Deck, which was priced to attract a broad audience, the Steam Machine occupies a much narrower niche. At well over $1,000, it isn't an impulse purchase or an easy recommendation for the average gamer. In fact, I still believe market demand is well below the optimistic projections some enthusiasts, including myself, have floated and are likely below the demand profile the Steam Deck enjoyed. Today's buyers are far more likely to be Linux enthusiasts, PC hardware aficionados, or gamers with a very specific interest in SteamOS than casual players looking for an alternative to an Xbox or a PlayStation. Really not an alternative, but an addition, right? That doesn't make the product unsuccessful. It simply defines the audience Valve is serving today. So when we first started hearing about the Steam Machine, my own projections as time went on was that we were probably going to see around an uptake of 10 to 15 million users. Now that was based on the pricing that I was expecting. Once the pricing was known, my own projection got revised down to about 5 million, and I think that's where we are based on the demographics of the addressable market that I just talked about in the preceding paragraph. Ironically, the long reservation queue may become more meaningful if the broader PC hardware market shifts. As GPU prices continue to rise and memory and storage remain under pressure from AI-driven demand, a pre-built Steam machine could become a more attractive alternative for some gamers than assembling a new gaming PC. While I expect a number of reservation holders will ultimately decline to purchase when their place in line arrives, those units are unlikely to sit idle. If demand for premium gaming hardware remains healthy, other buyers, including resellers hoping to capitalize on limited availability, will almost certainly absorb much of that excess inventory. So let's take a pause there and just talk about this demand, right? When we talk about the demand, I think the notion that, that Valve talks about that demand exceeds supply, the supply is very small. They didn't make that many. And they didn't make that many because the components cost so damn much. So there's a little bit of I forget what the term is that I want to use, right? A little bit of smoke screening going on, right? Demand isn't that high. It's just that there aren't that many. And I think that's the main thing. And where we do see demand, right? My point is, remember that demand is inclusive of not people who genuinely want the thing, but when you talk about the reservation queue, you're talking about people like me who signed up to the reservation queue who have no intention of buying the thing at this price, right? But I just want to see when I come up with the queue and get a feel for how quickly they're getting through it. You have people who, like I mentioned, signed up in the hopes that, well, I'm going to go ahead and sign up and maybe the price will come down. Or I don't know, maybe I'll win the lottery right by the time, I come up in the reservation queue. And when I talk about PC enthusiasts who might be interested in this thing, like I said, some of them I ascribed as people who are super interested in Linux or just super interested in being a participant in this evolution of the gaming industry. Obviously, right, you can build a better PC, right, blah, 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 blah. The people that I'm talking about are people on edge cases who are like this, who have a potato PC and feel that it wouldn't be a bad idea to upgrade. And when they look at the $1,049 to $1,500 price, right, they go, if I'm going to do an upgrade, it's going to mean I'm going to need a new GPU. I may need a new power supply. If I'm going to go to a new CPU, that may force me to go to a new socket. That may force me to go to DDR5. Now I'm into a motherboard, right? So it's people who are looking at these large-scale recap scenarios who say, I don't need that much. Like there's a fixed cost in that upgrade, right? Because that upgrade crosses a threshold where a ton of stuff gets hoovered up with it and comes with a ton of baggage. But those people may say, I don't need that much power, but I need more power than I have now. So we're talking about when Valve talked about they're targeting the Steam machine at the middle band of their user base. I'm talking about the people below, right, the middle band, right? Those people may look up and say, look, I can either spend, there's so much I've got to do here, that I'm like, and let's talk about GPUs, right? Like performant GPUs are $1,000 now. So people may look at that and say, well, look, to like bare minimum, right, cross this threshold, I'm going to be spending $2,000. Maybe I don't spend $2,000. Maybe I just spend the 1,500 or 1,000, right? There may be some people in those scenarios. And there may be some people who are on potato PCs who say, I need to upgrade, but my upgrade is going to force me to kind of go big metal. Maybe I buy a Steam box because it's more, a Steam machine because it's more powerful than what I have now, but I hold off, right, on making that bigger purchase until RAM prices come back down, until the RTX 6000 comes out, right? So again, I'm not talking about a huge number of people. Well, it is a huge number of people because the people below, like the vast majority of the PC market, I constantly say is like 86% is PC potato nation. There's 14% of us that are high enders. But the vast majority of that market doesn't spend money, right? So I'm not talking about, you know, all 86% of those people don't want to spend some money. They're on 7-year-old and 10-year-old PCs and they're fine sitting there playing at 1080p. They're not buying like these $800 OLEDs that are coming out like I'm on tonight. But anyway, they're not making that investment, right? So like there's a very, very small percentage in that 86% who are going to spend money within a window of time, right? So those are the people that I'm talking about might be attracted to this device. Hey, Dry Chisels, thanks so much for coming through. All right, let's continue rolling through. The more important story, however, has very little to do with reservation counts. Valve has already put its foot in the door with SteamOS hardware, and backing away now would send exactly the wrong signal. The company needs to demonstrate consistency, commitment, and confidence, not simply to consumers, but to potential hardware partners. SteamOS will only become a mainstream platform if major OEMs such as Asus, Acer, Dell, HP, Lenovo, Samsung, and others believe Valve is committed to supporting it for the long haul. They need to have the appearance of being Red Hat, right? Or the Ubuntu open source project. They need to present the appearance that they are in this for the long haul and are committed to being a Linux distro maintainer, right? With everything that comes along, right? That goes along with that. Those manufacturers possess purchasing power and supply chain advantages that Valve simply doesn't have, allowing them to build SteamOS powered systems at more competitive prices once they believe the ecosystem has staying power. So Valve has a critical threshold to get over here, right? An inflection point. If they can get to the point where they can convince, right, the common Windows laptop vendors that there's viability in building these boxes because here's an operating system vendor that is going to remain committed and keep their foot in the game, and that provides them a lower cost approach than a Windows box, particularly, right, because if you think about it, those guys could build, provide, and ship a Steam machine at a lower cost than a comparable Windows box because they don't have the licensing and because they would be using AMD components, which wouldn't force them to use NVIDIA components, which is really, if you want to sell, right, a mini PC or a gaming laptop, well, more specifically a gaming laptop, right, something small form factor, anything in the gaming PC space, you're most advantaged by selling it with an NVIDIA part, not with an AMD part. The AMD part, right, is only attractive to the crowd that is shopping for, that is more so oriented towards shopping for a bargain. Certainly everybody's trying to save money, but there are a lot of people who, they want the best deal that they can get, but they're also looking for the best performance, right? And most people feel that is coming from NVIDIA. In particular, the place that Valve could strike here, if they are able to effectively partner with hardware vendors, is in the space of mini PC. And so now, despite the fact that Asus owns the NUC spec now, there's been very tepid investment by the major laptop vendors, small form factor vendors, in mini PCs. You don't see HP building them. I mean, the ones HP builds are workstations. The ones Lenovo builds are workstations. They're not gaming mini PCs. The heavy investment in mini PCs has been from smaller vendors like Binox, like Minis Forum. Zotac makes some. But a lot of those things, even still now, and you could see the movement, and you could see where Valve has an opportunity to strike and where Valve would be effective and where Windows is losing ground. When you look at most of those mini PCs and most of their advertising and most of the purpose behind them, they are not for gaming. They are for AI. They are for AI developers to buy these machines, to put in their homes, and set up software factories to crank out Vive coded software, right, or to run auto research on these platforms that can do so very efficiently for a lower cost. So again, where there was a very short period of time where mini PCs were being oriented around gaming, or there were at least some enthusiast mini PCs, again, there were workstations primarily first. Then there was a brief period of time where there were some oriented towards gaming. That is already losing its hold. They're being pointed at PC, leaving open the space for a Steam OS, right, made by a primary laptop vendor, right, to come in and really maybe gain some traction. In that sense, Valve's promise to fulfill reservations by the end of the year is less about selling every Steam machine itself and more about proving that SteamOS is a platform worth investing in. The company's decision to release the Steam machine's enclosure CAD files under a Creative Commons license reinforces that philosophy by encouraging community involvement while signaling that SteamOS is intended to be an open ecosystem rather than another closed console. If Valve can maintain that commitment, convince OEMs to build compelling SteamOS hardware, and capitalize on the still underdeveloped mini PC market, today's relative niche product could become the foundation for something much larger tomorrow. I'm not saying it's going to go mainstream. I'm saying it can do something more than sell 5 million units, right? The Steam machine itself may never dominate the gaming market, will never dominate the gaming market, but it doesn't have to. Its greatest success may be proving that SteamOS deserves a permanent place in the PC hardware landscape, and I would just call it the general gaming appliance landscape. I don't want to call it console because that term seems charged, and it still kind of connotes this notion that Steam machine or these little laptop vendor boxes would be competitors to the PlayStation and the Xbox. They wouldn't be, at least not the PlayStation. They might be to Xbox if Xbox goes in this Project Helix rumored direction of being oriented around a hybrid console PC. All right, let me grab another drink, and then we'll move on to talk about Double Fine. Hey, Warwana, thanks so much for coming through. Okay, this news story over on VGC, Video Games Chronicle. By Chris Scullion. These actions are not taken lightly. Double Fine has laid off 23 staff after going independent. The studio, founded in 2000 by former LucasArts veteran Tim Schafer, was acquired by Microsoft in 2019 and developed Rad, Psychonauts 2, Keeper, and Kiln after that. Following news last month that Xbox planned to cut thousands of jobs as part of what CEO Asha Sharma called the most significant restructure in Xbox history, however, a number of Microsoft-owned studios faced closure. So let's skip over and start talking through my assessment. Double Fine's decision to lay off 23 employees only weeks after regaining its independence from Xbox should surprise no one who has been paying attention to the state of the games industry. When Microsoft began spinning studios out instead of simply closing them, many observers celebrated the move as a compassionate alternative. I argued at the time that it merely sent these studios out into one of the most hostile funding environments the industry has seen in years. Independence may sound appealing, but it also means leaving behind the financial security of a platform holder and entering a market where venture capital has largely dried up. Publishers have become increasingly risk-averse, and even critically acclaimed games are no guarantee of survival. And the primary example that I point at is I can't remember the name of the studio, Striking Distance maybe, but the developers of Callisto Protocol, a studio founded by the creative director of Dead Space. Game sold. Didn't sell well, but game by any critical measure was a good game. Game didn't sell well enough. Studio was forced to close. So a lot of hullabaloo, especially during the acquisition, particularly from Xbox fans, about how you don't have to worry about industry consolidation. When some of these studios will spin out and become independent, and I'm like, that's not a that's not a guarantee for success in this current environment. And it wasn't back then, and damn sure isn't now. This outcome is the product of several converging forces. And again, the people I'm throwing shade at, and I am going to say directly, I'm throwing shade. Tons of people who came out when this reset was talked about, with these 3,200 layoffs coming, who said, well, it's not that bad. It could have been worse. At least these studios are getting an opportunity to go independent. Like, again, right, there's only... Double Fine is maybe all the studios that were spun off and sold, I think, are, round out to about 100 heads. So, this is a quarter of the staff roughly that got laid off. Actually, Double Fine might be a little larger. I need to go back and look at that. I didn't look at that before the show. They might be a little larger, but significant number of people, right, laid off. This outcome is a product of several converging forces. Microsoft's stewardship of Xbox Game Studios under Phil Spencer demonstrated an alarming lack of disciplined project governance, with studios seemingly allowed to operate for years without the structured milestone reviews, budget oversight, and schedule accountability that are standard practice throughout much of the software industry. At the same time, Double Fine now faces the harsh realities of independence, where every payroll, every lease, every piece of development equipment must be justified against an uncertain funding pipeline. Those pressures exist across the industry, but they are not universal. Other platform holders have demonstrated that creative studios can flourish within larger organizations when expectations are clearly defined, projects are actively governed, and leadership works collaboratively with developers to keep troubled productions on track instead of allowing problems to compound over years. Again, Xbox's problems, the behaviors that are institutionalized there, are not prevalent across the entire industry. They're not prevalent at other platform owners like Nintendo and PlayStation. They are, hyper-specifically, culturally institutionalized problems at Xbox, yea verily within the umbrella that is Microsoft. I also believe Tim Schafer when he says these layoffs were necessary. Throughout his career, Schafer has consistently been candid about the stress of securing funding and the burden that business responsibilities place on creative leadership. In fact, one of the reasons he welcomed Microsoft's acquisition of Double Fine was because it allowed him to focus on making games instead of constantly pitching publishers and investors. That history makes his latest statement all the more credible. Rather than viewing these layoffs as a public relations exercise, as is the case with some other executives, I see them as an indication that Double Fine has not yet secured its next major funding agreement. Reducing headcount buys the studio something incredibly valuable: time to build a compelling prototype, prepare a strong pitch, and convince a publisher that its next project deserves investment. So my point of that is that when they left, there was some money on the books. Probably walked out the door of Microsoft not completely broke, right? Some amount of cash on hand. That cash on hand gets expended and dwindles every payroll, right? Every time you pay a number of developers. Unfortunately, reducing cash extends the total burn down life expectancy of that pile of cash. And what this indicates to me by having to cut those heads is that I don't think Double Fine right now has a publishing deal that they have secured with a major third-party publisher or a smaller third-party publisher. They have not successfully pitched an idea to someone that is committed to funding. They probably don't have a prototype or a working vertical slice that they can go and show someone. Maybe they walked out of the door with something of that ilk or close to it, but they need time. They need time to go make that pitch. They need time to secure that deal. They need time to secure that line of credit, that funding, whatever it may be. And I don't think that they have it now, and I think that's why they had to pull the trigger on the 23 heads. I think they were looking at the timeline and running the calculations and saw that, like, hey, if we don't drop 23 people, that money is going to run out before we can get a prototype and a working vertical slice and go demo this to a potential funder and investor, and get funding, right, to carry the studio for the next few years. So somebody from Warrun said 93 staff, I believe they had. Okay, so we're about 100 people then. So that's about a quarter of the staff. That's about the amount of people they hired when they got put onto Xbox, so it made sense to me. And their last project wasn't turning any heads. Great. Unfortunately, I don't believe independence offers Double Fine a healthier long-term future by itself. Without a stable publishing partner, the studio will likely find itself living project to project, constantly balancing creative ambition against financial survival. Today's publishers are far quicker to cancel projects than they were a decade ago, often writing off investments rather than committing additional funding to games that drift off schedule or exceed budget. That means Double Fine cannot afford prolonged development cycles or expensive missteps. The studio would be well served by becoming even leaner, focusing on smaller games with roughly 2-year development timelines, and modernizing its production pipeline so it can deliver higher production values without proportionally increasing cost. Just as importantly, I believe the company should actively pursue partnerships, if not acquisition, by publishers such as Devolver Digital or Annapurna, organizations that have repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to nurture unconventional studios. Right, so a key problem in today's environment is that these publishers, right, who have historically provided funding, including even Xbox, who has stated so out loud, they are tending to only put money behind sure bets. And so, like, the days and times where somebody who can make like a quirky Double Fine game, that is going to be really difficult to secure funding for in this current environment, unless some publisher, right, sees a potential banger, and that's just kind of not normally Double Fine's thing. That type of thing they will get traction on at Devolver Digital or Annapurna or some of these larger. I mean, the good thing is I have seen a rise in the number of what I would call indie publishing houses, right? Publishing houses that are kind of specifically oriented around supporting smaller scale, double A type of content. And so that is their best bet, right? And what I think they should be striking for. Ultimately, the story is not really about Double Fine alone. It is about the difficult transition from the safety of first-party ownership into an industry that has become increasingly unforgiving. Microsoft may have preserved these studios by granting them independence instead of shutting them down outright, but independence is not the same as security. The real challenge begins after the headlines fade, when founders must once again spend their days chasing funding instead of building games. I sincerely hope Double Fine succeeds. Few studios have contributed as much creativity and personality to the medium of the past 2 decades, but today's layoffs are a reminder that creative talent alone is no longer enough. In the current games industry, survival requires disciplined execution, financial resilience, and a partner willing to invest for the long term. One of the most interesting talks that I listened to was, I think it was one of the last GameIndustry.biz podcasts that Christopher Dring and I can't remember the other guy's name. Maybe it was James Balfour, but the guy who's the managing editor or the executive editor at GameIndustry.biz when they got bought out by the publishing group that owns IGN. One of their last podcasts was a podcast where they had like a round table of investors and publishers who were specifically oriented around the indie space, one of which was Rami Ismail, who is a popular consultant who often gets hired by indie developers and indie studios looking to kind of get some coaching for getting their game to market. And a lot of the terminology they used was, Rami says, look, like, only like he rattled off a lot of the statistics that I have rattled off many times before about the very small number of games on Steam that actually like pierce the veil, right? That actually, make over $1 million. The large number of games that, are lucky if they cross $100,000. The very small number, like the high concentration of a very small number of games that earn like 90-something% of the revenue, right, out of the newly published games on Steam. And he said, look, that's the bracket, like that's the target. If your game, if the concept you're coming up with your game, if you don't have the confidence that your game is going to get into that competitive group, then why are you making it? And at that point, again, he's talking about coaching teams that are like talking about making things to be, financially viable. I mean, there's tons of people making indie games that are just looking to be part of the creative process and like they don't care how much money they make, right? Whatever. They toil away in a garage, after hours for 6 years to get their game out, only to have their game blown up because EA decides to shadow drop the Command and Conquer like remasters out of nowhere without telling anybody, like that kind of stuff. Like those people, right? He's not talking to those people. He's talking to people who have employees who are looking to make payroll, right, and coaching them. And those recommendations were echoed. Other members of that panel were heads of studios, that were again indie, but at scale. So they were like maybe 35 to 50 people, and they would have gaming jam sessions. So they would take like a couple of weeks or whatever for everybody to just go off in small teams and work prototypes. And And a lot of times their criteria for throwing out a game and deciding to not work on it was, hey, is this game gonna pierce the veil of that competitive category? And they would all as a team, right, vote yay or nay, and shut those games down. And lots of times those were darling projects, right, that they could see would be fun to work on, but they're just like they weren't gonna work on those games to send those games out to die, right, for no reason, when they could already project and see that they weren't gonna stick the landing. Yeah, I think they are in trouble. Yeah, I think. Yeah, and look, it's not just Double Fine, but like Compulsion Games, as Compulsion Games, puts together an award-winning game, not Game of the Year, but an award is an award, so award-winning game. Like before these guys announced that they're laying people off, Compulsion Games is posting tweets saying, hey, we're looking to work for people basically as a support studio. So here's this team who has put out an award-winning game who's saying, look, we don't need to be the lead studio. We're fully willing to take on contract work and to be the support studio and be, number two, right? And that's the world we live in. And the other two studios, Ninja Theory and not In Exile, Undead Labs, are supposedly being sold off. But look, we shouldn't be following the influencers or the content creators that are telling you that that's a good deal, right? Because here's what's largely likely potential to happen. Those teams will go to those publishers who are smaller and have a smaller financial base than Xbox, right? That's almost by definition, because Xbox, despite the fact that we talk about the problem that they are, in hand with Sony, earns over 50% of the revenue in the combined PC and gaming market, right? So by definition, whoever they're going to is somebody smaller than Xbox, and definitely without the financial backing of something like a Microsoft. So those teams are going to go to those publishers with some cash in hand, right? A goodbye kiss, sweetheart departure dowry, breakup dowry from Xbox to continue completing those games. Those publishers got to make decisions. Those publishers may say, this game doesn't look like it's going to stick the landing. This game doesn't look like it's going to pierce the veil. And I got to make choices and decisions about, money that I'm investing. Xbox is saying they're going to cover. I feel almost certain that there's clauses in there that say, hey, we're going to cover like the development, but we're going to cover the development based on like today's projections. And so if the project runs over budget, runs behind schedule, that's on you, the new owner. And when things start hitting that point, that new owner may just decide, hey, I'm not willing to put skin. Like this is like me with a house, right? Where I say I never buy a house that is that's being sold for more than it's appraised, right? If the appraiser comes by and says that this house is not worth what it's being sold at, I'm not putting my own money in to cover the delta, right? The house needs to appraise at the amount that you're telling me the house is worth and you're trying to sell it to me for. I'm not covering the balance. So you may have that same type of behavior and attitude at a new publisher. And those studios, as a result, could get shut down, right? Could go away. Their projects could get canceled. This is what's being done with these studios is no guarantee of survival. It's not some altruistic thing that Xbox did out of the goodness of their hearts. They did it because there's a financial upside to not taking as much of an impairment or not taking an impairment on that studio. They did it for business reasons. As you guys know, I'm very kind of tired of this whole notion of anointing Xbox as this good guy who does things for the benefit of the consumer, while in the meantime, they have literally slashed 9,500 jobs. Like, a employee population the size of most of your third-party publishers. Like, I don't even think Ubisoft has 9,500 employees at this point, right, with all the people that they've laid off. So, like, they have literally laid off as many people as most third-party publishers, big third-party publishers in the industry have on payroll now. And we're still trying to contort this picture and squeeze the square peg into a round hole and say that Xbox is some like altruistic, I don't know. I don't get it. I really don't get it. But we're going to talk about evidence-based analysis tonight. So let me grab another drink and we will get in to talk about the Xbox earnings. Let's see. Let me catch up with the chat before I do that. I think State of Decay 3 is going to do really good based on what I've seen so far. I've been following the development and alpha closely. In 8, I will tell you, you have more confidence than I do. We will see. It will be interesting to see how that turns out. Hey, Brap. Thanks so much for coming through, Brap. Appreciate it. Downloading this episode to listen to on the flight back. Thanks so much. Warwana 9500 is like what ABK was then purchase rate. It may be. I'm not absolutely positive. Yeah, Microsoft as a whole in the last 5 years have laid off a small country. Yeah. Yes, very true. All right, let me take a drink and we'll get into the Xbox earnings. All right, we might actually wrap up in less than 2 hours tonight. That's always been my goal. I really don't understand how the last couple episodes they've gotten as long as they have been. That has not been my intention. Okay, this news story over on IGN. By Virginia Glaze. A funny name. I don't think this article is heavily apologetic or overly optimistic about Xbox, but it would be funny if it was, and the author's name was Virginia Glaze. Xbox CEO Asha Sharma gives optimistic outlook despite grim fiscal earnings report. Xbox CEO Asha Sharma responded to the company's Q4 2026 fiscal report, which showed a continued decline in earnings for both content and hardware. Microsoft's Form 10-K SEC filing has been released, showing that Xbox has continued to experience notable revenue loss at the end of their 2026 fiscal year. As told in the filing, Xbox's revenue decreased by $1.7 billion or 7%, driven by declines in Xbox content, services, and Xbox hardware. So at this point, I want to kind of skip over to things I wrote up about this on Blue Sky. My Xbox predictions were off. The story goes, impairment charges at Xbox, but I have not been able to track down exactly where the impairments were taken. I crawled through the entirety of all of the documents that Xbox submitted in its earnings report, including their SEC 10-K, including numerous other supplementary documents. I could not find a specific definition of where they took impairments. I'll talk about where those were likely here in a minute. Xbox content and services down 10% for Q4, the third straight quarter of negative growth. Q1 was flat, Q2 was down 6%, Q3 was down 7%. Now in Q4, they were down 10%. Hardware down 14% for Q4. One thing that I want to talk about for the Q4 number. Lots of hullabaloo about two things. One was that the price cut in Game Pass had caused a resurgence in Game Pass numbers. Maybe that was true, but the net impact of that was just churn and maybe a recovery of even more loss than they'd had than we kind of would surmise. Remember back in February of 2024 at the Xbox Game Business Update, which was part of the official Xbox podcast, which was hosted by Tina Amini, who is an Xbox employee. It was reported that they were at 34 million subscribers. And then more recently, it was reported in, I think, another leaked Asha Sharma communique that they were down to 30 million. So being down to 30 million and then us being able to see the actual filed result that they were 10% down on content and services does not lead me to believe that supposed rise in returning Xbox Game Pass subscribers was at all whatsoever impactful. Hardware was down 14% for Q4. Again, the second thing that I have a rub with is the pom-pomming and cheerleading that went on about Xboxes being up 86% in sales for the month of June when the NPD numbers came out. As I always talk about, particularly with Xbox numbers or Microsoft numbers really in general, 86% of nothing is still nothing, right? Is not impactful. And so as we can see, by hardware being down 14% and a surge of 86% in sales in the month of June had no impact. Content and services were down 6% for FY26. FY26 total Xbox revenue was $21.79 billion, a 7.1% loss year over year, compared to Sony GNS, which had flat sales, but margin was up by 12% year over year to end the year with an operating, I don't know why I said OE, it should have been OI, of almost 10%. Xbox hardware was down 29% year over year for FY26, and division revenue was down a total dollar amount of $1.7 billion. Longer write-up here before we get to the other longer write-up. Looking across Microsoft's SEC 10K filings for FY25 and 26, for this year, Microsoft elevated Xbox. And so what I did was I ran a diff of the FY25 SEC 10K and the FY26 SEC 10K to look for the deltas in what they wrote in their filing with the SEC. So for this year, Microsoft elevated Xbox Cloud Gaming as a discrete defined value stream in its Xbox Financial non-GAAP definition. Last year, it was only defined as hardware and content and services. Despite all the hullabaloo about Asha getting rid of every screen as an Xbox, their 10K this year revised wording to indicate expansion beyond the console. So again, here I'm saying Asha Sharma and the army of influencers made a very big deal that they were getting rid of every screen as an Xbox because now we're trying to do this revisionist history where we write a hit piece on Sarah Bond and declare that everything that she did was horrible, which is ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous, as she was referred to the Queen in Green on numerous occasions. But now she's been thrown under the bus, I strongly believe, because she's black and because she's a woman. Despite that, what they actually filed in their 10K is in line with that strategic vector. New language includes new devices from third-party manufacturers, not our native organic console. PC and mobile endpoints, not our native console. Expanding to new ecosystems, not our native console. Business diversification across subscriptions, ads, and digital stores, not hyper-focusing on the console. Again, this is what they filed in their official filings, despite all the rhetoric that 80% of our business is console. This is a return of Xbox. This is a reset. You guys who are running around waving these flags, waving these terrible towels, talking about all the PR and the things that are being said on social media and not paying attention to the officially filed financial reports and what they are actually saying to shareholders and are legally bound to execute upon to remain regulatorily compliant. These are all new strategic statements from last year's 10K. Most notable is that there is almost no discussion about the console figuring into the Xbox business model in the FY26 10K. These may simply be time-delayed corrections of a long-standing pivot that failed to make it into last year's 10K and were revised this year, but the articulation of the pivot came after the end of last fiscal year. Theoretically, there's been a pivot going on, there's been a return, there's been a reset that abolishes all of the mentality, philosophy, and thinking of the past regime. But yet what they filed in the financial statement, which was not filed until several months after Asha Sharma came to power, says exactly in keeping with those things that were previously conveyed. These may simply be time-delayed corrections of a long-standing pivot that failed to make it into last year's 10K, but that leaves them still in contrast to the PR of the return of Xbox and a focus on the console. What has actually been legally filed as information to shareholders does not say that. Finally, the impairments. The impairments were likely against the following events. The money's already expended in the funding of the initiative and development of Perfect Dark, which was closed and canceled in July of 2025. Money's already expended in development of Everwild at Rare, canceled in July of 2025. And the July 2025 cancellation of Project Blackbird at ZeniMax Online Studios. All of the recent July 2, 2026 announcements of studio spin-offs and sales will likely show up in FY27 reporting. So Compulsion, Double Fine, Ninja Theory, Undead Labs, Arcane Studios, if that reaches final arbitration in France and that studio is also sold off or something happens with it, spun off, whatever, and any other restructuring during the reset. Ooh, I don't know what happened there. Okay, I think I just flipped it upside down in OBS. That was not my intention. It's still upside down. Okay, now it's right side up. But now I think it's right side up, but backwards. Okay. Now my little thumbnail for the upper corner of the camera port is right. Okay, let's talk about my larger analysis. Let's catch up with the chat, and I probably need to take a drink before we get into that because this one is long. Here it under what a name glaze. I'm not sure about the spelling. It is yes, that is the spelling. It is Virginia. Yes, Virginia Glaze, spelled exactly that. Sarbon is a certified baddie. She did nothing wrong except not saying goodbye. Right, or you are exactly correct. But again, if I were pissed off because you were trying to throw me under the bus and make me the scapegoat, I wouldn't have said goodbye either. I'd have said some things. I'd have definitely said some things. They would not have been goodbye. not in any polite way, not strewn with profanity. I may have said something about letting the doorknob hit you on the way out. So yeah, let me grab a drink before we get into this. So I see RPG88 showed up in the chat. Thank you so much for coming through. Where I want to, yeah, I was so shocked she got thrown under the bus, to be honest. Yeah. No, I mean, you can do that when you hire Tom Warren to write a hit piece for her, right? In exchange for access. Okay, let's get into it. When Xbox CEO Asha Sharma told employees and investors that the gaming division expects to return to growth by the end of fiscal year 2027, the statement was intended to project confidence during an otherwise disappointing earnings report. Predictably, much of the conversation that followed focused on assigning blame. Some argued the results still reflected the final consequences of Phil Spencer's leadership, while others insisted it was too early to judge Sharma's tenure, both of which are apologies for Asha Sharma and her regime. Earlier this year, I wrote that Xbox's problems are Xbox's responsibility to fix, and I think that principle remains the correct lens through which to evaluate these earnings. Leadership changes matter, but the financial realities facing Xbox today are institutional, not personal, not personality-driven. The business must ultimately be judged by its execution rather than by whichever executive occupies the corner office. One of the recurring themes in Xbox discourse is the tendency to externalize responsibility. When hardware sales decline, we're told the console market is shrinking. When software underperforms, we're reminded that game development has become more expensive. When restructuring occurs, we're told the entire industry is facing headwinds. All of these statements contain elements of truth, yet they often become convenient explanations, i.e. scapegoats, rather than meaningful analysis. Nintendo, PlayStation, and every major publisher operate under the same macroeconomic conditions. They contend with AI-driven component shortages, inflationary manufacturing costs, higher labor expenses, and increasing development budgets. Those pressures are real, but they do not explain why Xbox consistently underperforms relative to its own objectives. Xbox's challenges are, first and foremost, the responsibility of Xbox to solve. That distinction becomes especially important when evaluating Sharma's forecast of returning to growth by the end of FY27. Looking strictly at the evidence available today, I struggle to see a path that supports such a rapid turnaround. Xbox finished the fiscal year with declining revenue, continued deterioration in hardware performance, and a content and services segment that has now posted multiple consecutive quarters of contraction. Again, the content and services was kind of the crown jewel, right, of the Xbox performance envelope. Hardware was kind of known to be failing and has been failing for 3 years, maybe 4. Content and services was always this thing that kept it going. Game Pass is part of that. Now we have seen 3 straight quarters of contraction, and that's a damning indictment of what's going on. At the same time, the division has undergone sweeping layoffs, studio closures, project cancellations, and divestitures that inevitably reduce near-term development capacity. Optimism is an important leadership quality, but optimism is not itself evidence. Before accepting projections of renewed growth, investors should reasonably expect to understand where that growth will originate. Now, I don't expect us, right, you guys in the audience, to be investors, but there are some members, which I hope is largely the community that I talk to, that are oriented and interested in understanding the realities of the industry, right? That you play games as entertainment and you enjoy what games you enjoy. But when you want to pay attention to the news, you're paying attention to the news in objective business terms. Hopefully not filled with a ton of emotion. Although when it comes to digital versus physical media, a lot of you guys are full of emotion. But largely, on everything else that we either agree in or agree to have a conversation about, there's a desire to remain largely objective about it. The announced software lineup does little to alleviate those concerns. Halo Combat Evolved has failed to generate the commercial momentum expected of one of Microsoft's flagship franchises. I'm predicting right now sales, if you're lucky, in excess just north of 1 million. And that's even an optimistic take on my real projections, which show it coming in at like right at 1 million or maybe even less. So Halo Combat Evolved has failed to generate the commercial momentum expected of one of Microsoft's flagship franchises, while community reception has been mixed. Right now, it's 65%, right? Steam user community review, and I know there are a lot of console people who are like, oh, they talk about Steam community user reviews. If you think Steam community user reviews don't have an impact, like there's a way and a dynamic in which Steam community user reviews have an impact. There are certain games that have like really weird, long-standing communities, and like this is the light that I paint the Civilization franchise in, right? So Civilization could put out a mediocre, arguably a bad game, because Civ 7, I think Civ 7 at some point after launch was like actually mostly negative. It was definitely mixed. And it stayed mixed a long time. But yet that game was in the platinum tier when Steam put out its user review, its revenue medal tiers at the end of the year. There are some properties and IPs and franchises that can get away with that. The picture that's being painted right now for Halo is it is one of those IPs that in my mind has become antiquated and it does not have the traction in today's market that it used to. And so when you have a property like that and people go to your page and you're in the yellow, then you're probably not, you're going to be subject to a lot of negative impact on your sales because people aren't going to be interested in playing your game because they can go play tons of other games, especially ones that are cheaper for that PC crowd. Than your game, right? Gears of War E-Day returns to another legacy property that has struggled for years to meaningfully expand its audience. Clockwork Revolution appears destined to launch primarily into Xbox's comparatively small console install base, immediately limiting its addressable market. Again, same thing for Gears E-Day, right? So you're struggling to make revenue, right? Struggling to make sales numbers. And again, I revisit this decision that you're going to keep some properties exclusive, ostensibly because you're trying to give people a reason to buy an Xbox, which you have priced now at like $850. Like again, like these I have said, even under Phil Spencer, I said historically I would always say I totally agree and understand the strategy. It's their execution that's lacking. But we have now entered a world under this Xbox administration, this regime, where I don't understand the strategy. The decisions that are being made are nonsensical to me, almost farcical in their expected outcome. And we'll talk about some of the comments that are made that tell me that they're just not grounded in reality. Fable may represent the company's strongest commercial opportunity thanks to its broader platform strategy, but it enters an increasingly crowded release calendar filled with heavyweight competition. Even if every one of these titles performs respectably, it is difficult to envision them collectively generating the kind of revenue acceleration required to reverse the division's broader financial trajectory within a single fiscal year. Now, 2 months ago when they did the showcase, right, Fable coming out in February seemed like a good deal. But now all of a sudden, here's what February looks like. Tomb Raider Legacy of Atlantis comes out February 12th, 2027. Coming to PC, PS5, Xbox Series X and S, and Switch 2. God of War Lofi comes out February 16th, 2027, coming to PS5. And is now, for a property that I think is seen as a marquee IP, now only available to play on PlayStation 5. Persona 4 Revival comes out February 18th, 2027, coming to PC, PS5, Xbox Series X and S. So your competition there is multi-platform, but for a JRPG series that is highly revered as one of the best and most well-liked JRPG franchises. Fable finally comes out on February 23rd, 2027, coming to PC, PS5, Xbox Series X and S. It is day one on Game Pass, so you're immediately going to get depression of any potential sales numbers. It now comes out in the fourth week of February when people have potentially spent money on Tomb Raider, God of War Lofi, or Persona 4 Revival. Right, that slate makes it a much more difficult release window for projecting how well Fable is going to do. And on top of that, you have Metro 2039, which is going to come out sometime that month. I think 4A Studios has not declared a date, but that gaming is coming to PC, PS5, Xbox Series X and S. The other shadow that kind of looms over this, like kind of an asteroid blocking out the sun, is what is going to happen with GTA 6. When are they going to drop GTA 6 online? When are they going to drop GTA 6 PC? I don't necessarily say that I'm predicting that to happen in February, but my point is that's an 800-ton humpback whale that, like, whenever they drop it, it's just going to obliterate, right, anything trying to gain traction on the market at the time, I think. So, you know, things look tougher for Fable at this point, is my point. Steam reviews matter the most, way more than Metacritic, in my opinion. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Real Nate, February is stacked. Fable could move to May or June, and PlayStation will put Intergalactic next to it. That's they could be playing the role of spoiler. Hero Down Under. I'm wondering if PlayStation is being petty about the Gears thing. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, so part of the problem in my view is that Xbox continues to evaluate success through metrics that often obscure the underlying economics. Sharma highlighted hundreds of millions of new Xbox players joining the ecosystem over the first years. This is our first metric, right, where, like, again, there's a lot of altruism being heaped upon Asha's right profile, and I'm like, no, I think you guys are not listening to what she says, and you're not listening and paying attention to the fact that she throws out these metrics, which are the type of juicy tidbits that only Xbox would know, and that Xbox is kind of known for being pervasive about not revealing. And so what happens when she drops these things is you get so surprised, you're so starstruck, right, by this metric, by this KPI that comes out that she just casually dropped, and you become immured and, like, convinced of this transparency that you don't pay attention to what it means and what she says right after it. So Sharma highlighted hundreds of millions of new Xbox players joining the ecosystem over the past year. On its surface, that sounds impressive. Yet those reported gains occurred alongside declining overall revenue and weakening content and services performance. If player counts increase while revenue falls, then the average economic value generated by each player necessarily declines, right? This is the math that people ignore when they, right? So let's say the 200 million people were net new. Probably not, right? They would be at 700, maybe they would be at 700 million MAU, maybe that's what she means. Or if you take the other tact of, like, let's take those 200 million players and peanut butter them across the 12 months and say that, okay, so your MAU went up to 516 million, maybe. Whichever way you slice it, that means that their ARPU is overall down. If they experience a net increase in consumers, right, in customers coming to the Xbox platform, but then wound up down on revenue, down on Game Pass numbers, down on content and services, down on hardware, that means you've got more people in the ecosystem spending on average less money. I have historically been calculating their ARPU at about $47-ish per user, whereas PlayStation's is just south of $250 per user. Based on, like, picking and choosing some assumptions to make about these new numbers she's presenting, I'm calculating that their ARPU is down to around $42 and some change per user. So you have a user base that is actually spending less money over time. Whether those users represent entirely new customers, churn replacement, or broader engagement across Microsoft's ecosystem matters less than one simple question. Are they spending more money? Thus far, the financial statement suggests the answer is no. Like a flat out no. Like a hell nah. They ain't spending more money. Right? You're getting more people coming into the ecosystem. And even if they just mean that you're at 501 million MAU, they're spending less money overall. Again, yet another damning indictment of kind of what's going on. within the Xbox business framework. That same disconnect appears when discussing Game Pass. Xbox leadership has repeatedly described the subscription service as profitable, but profitability depends entirely upon the accounting framework being applied. Public financial reporting measures one thing: internal total cost. Public financial reporting measures one thing, and I've talked to you guys about this before. Like, what we put on a balance sheet is entirely put on a balance sheet to make things look a certain way. Internal total cost accounting, TCA, which is the formal accounting term, right? That if you go to accounting at the graduate level, right, this is a thing that you learn. Internal total cost accounting measures something very different. A subscription service can generate positive operating income while simultaneously reducing the lifetime profitability of first-party software by cannibalizing full-price purchases. That means when I'm looking at the P&L profile of a capital investment for software development, and I take those costs and I amortize them, and then I start depreciating those costs over time, which I can only start doing once I start recognizing revenue because the thing has gone on sale. That means in a total cost accounting equation, I look at what the opportunity costs are, where I'm spending money in a way that directly contributes to people not buying this asset that I have made a capital investment in. I am making a total cost assessment of what it's costing to drive my business and make it go. And that means I'm taking those costs off of what I feel Game Pass is earning. Every player who experiences a major first-party release through Game Pass instead of purchasing it outright represents an opportunity cost that rarely enters public discussion. Outside observers cannot quantify that figure with precision because Microsoft's internal cost accounting remains confidential, as it does at every company. No company reveals their total cost accounting. That's why there's TCA versus what we put on the balance sheet. However, assuming that opportunity cost is zero would be equally indefensible. Not just equally indefensible, foolish, uneducated, uninformed, ridiculous. The truth also almost certainly lies somewhere between those extremes, and it deserves far more attention than it currently receives. The strategic adjustments Microsoft has already made suggest the company understands these pressures. Game Pass has become increasingly segmented through higher price tiers, lower cost plans with reduced benefits, and changes to day one access for major releases. Call of Duty's altered availability and the migration of premium features toward more expensive subscription tiers resemble a series of incremental experiments designed to improve monetization. I would not be surprised if future first-party releases spend longer periods outside the subscription service before arriving on Game Pass. What's a way to increase sales particularly if you're gonna make something exclusive? Don't put it in Game Pass day and date. If that occurs, it would not represent a philosophical reversal so much as an acknowledgement that substantial subscription economics, say that 3 times very fast, that substantial subscription economics require greater balance between accessibility and direct software sales. Let's get caught up with chat. Yeah, how can you grow downward? I remember when I first learned about the cost of selling in 2025, my mind was blown. Where I believe the discussion should become more uncomfortable for Xbox is in its operational governance. This has been a recurring theme in my analysis for years. One of the defining characteristics of Phil Spencer's tenure was the apparent absence of disciplined program governance across Xbox game studios. Software engineering, aerospace defense, and virtually every other large-scale project management discipline relies upon structured milestone reviews, schedule variance analysis, budget oversight, earned value reporting, and clearly defined decision gates. Projects that drift off course are expected to present recovery plans, what many organizations simply call a return to green. Throughout Spencer's leadership, we repeatedly saw projects disappear for years, consume enormous budgets, miss release targets, or ultimately face cancellation without any public indication that meaningful governance intervention had occurred. Whether those conversations happened privately or not, the outcomes strongly suggest a governance model that failed to identify and correct problems early enough. That weakness becomes even more apparent when contrasted with the practices employed elsewhere in the industry. PlayStation has demonstrated that studios can be granted creative freedom while still operating within a disciplined portfolio management framework. Projects like you don't get from 8% margin to 10% margin with a 12% margin increase over a year after you publicly came out to investors and said, hey, we're going to tighten our belts and we're going to turn to improved profitability because there's fiscal responsibility going on at these studios, especially at places like Bungie. Like, you literally call Bungie out by name on at an investors meeting week. right? And you get back to that profitability. Projects are regularly reviewed against schedule, budget, technical progress, and strategic objectives. Delays are not automatically fatal so long as developers can clearly articulate why they occurred and how the project returns to acceptable performance. Nintendo has similarly built a culture that emphasizes long-term stewardship of talent rather than reacting to every temporary financial fluctuation with wholesale restructuring. Neither company is immune from failure, neither PlayStation nor Nintendo, but both have generally demonstrated stronger institutional discipline in balancing creative ambition with operational accountability. That difference matters because great creative work still requires great management. Again, I think I've mentioned it on this channel before. I've definitely mentioned it on BRAP. One of the big things that has always stuck with me in my personal career, right, in software management, was a interview that Kaz Hirai, former head of PlayStation, former head of Sony corporate, said in an interview, I think with Greg Miller and Colin Moriarty, back where they were still at IGN, and he mentioned he said one of the most challenging things I've experienced in software management is that your most talented teams are your most challenging. They are the ones that challenge you most as a leader. And so again, I foot-stamp my point that if you were going to have great creatives, you have to have great creative management. And more so, I would even say, without great management, it's difficult to raise a culture where great creatives grow, right? And that's one of the things that I've pointed to at these Xbox studios before. I see no great bird of the galaxy. I don't see a Miyamoto. I don't see the generals that I see at PlayStation. I don't see people like the head of Polyphony, the head of Insomniac, Druckmann, Barlog, right? These, admittedly, sometimes like things that run the risk of being these cults of personality. I think that is a problem at Naughty Dog. Not so much at Sony Santa Monica. And I suspect heavily, because it's part of the Asian culture, I suspect that it's not a problem at Polyphony. But we'll see. Ironically, the restructuring undertaken under Sharma may ultimately represent an acknowledgement of those governance failures. Studio divestitures, workforce reductions, and project cancellations are painful, but they also reduce organizational complexity. Whether these actions become the foundation of a healthier Xbox or merely another round of cost-cutting depends entirely upon what replaces the old operating model. If the same governance practices remain in place, then smaller organizational charts alone will not produce better outcomes. Sustainable improvement requires more than reducing expenses. It requires fundamentally improving how projects are selected, supervised, and delivered. And so one of my great flies in the ointment here is you're doing these things. I mean, and clearly I do want to say there clearly has been governance improvement, because you wouldn't because one of the death knells, right, I think of studios that's coming out and is becoming normalized, I don't think everybody's caught on to it's becoming normalized, is that when there is a report that Xbox Studio Project X is reportedly over budget, that's because over budget is being wielded as an axe, right? And so if you hear that terminology, that phraseology, even if it's a rumor, I would start tracking that, because that may be an indicator that, because there's clearly little to no tolerance for things being over budget in this regime. And so we heard that with Fable. We heard that with, I can't remember what other Xbox project it was that we heard. I think we heard Blade was over budget. And of course, then we got the news that Arcane was entering arbitration, right, to decide what to do with it. So that would be a thing that I would pay attention to. For Xbox players, the implications are sobering. Subscribers who remain in the ecosystem primarily because of Game Pass, right? Because I think you have two key, basic bifurcations in the Xbox 9.855% of the console consumer base, combined console PC consumer base, that are still on Xbox. They're there for one of two reasons. Either they're there because of the low cost opportunity that Game Pass represents, or they're there because they love the hardware and they love the ecosystem and they're big spenders. So those are the two. But what's crazy is that as I articulate those two demographics, they are wildly opposed to each other in their consumption behaviors and consumption habits. But they also seem to both co-sign and give everything a pass that Xbox does, as long as it doesn't disrupt one of those two things, right? For the hardcore, as long as they continue to do hardware, and for the I'm only here because of the low cost, that crowd got really riled up when Game Pass went up to $30. But they seem to not be riled up as much when things move up tier and get paywalled. So I assume that all those people, that demographic, are predominantly on Game Pass Ultimate. Subscribers who remain in the ecosystem primarily because of Game Pass should prepare for continued evolution of the service, including additional feature segmentation, higher value premium tiers, and further experimentation around day one releases. Hardware enthusiasts should temper expectations regarding Microsoft's next-generation console strategy, as economic realities may force compromises on previously rumored capabilities, storefront integration, and pricing. Right? Because what's been said is that the industry's not going to do well selling $1,000 consoles. And what's been said about the Xbox business model is the Xbox business model is not going to do well selling $1,000 consoles. So I think there's absolutely going to be heavy investigation at de-scoping what Project Helix is. Perhaps most importantly, fans should prepare for another period in which first-party output becomes increasingly dependent upon downloadable content, remasters, and live service updates, while the effects of recent restructuring ripple through the development pipeline. Large AAA studios cannot lose projects, leadership, and thousands of employees without creating downstream consequences. So let me say that a little more plainly. My estimates are that the production pipeline has been impacted to the point where they cannot get out first-party studio AAA content in late 2027 and 2028, and you're probably not going to have big first-party releases that could be anything near equating to having the potential of being a banger until 2029. And by 2029, theoretically, you're on Project Helix. These studios have been hit. They've hit a reset button, right? To where, like, if you're lucky in 2029, what you will get is Obsidian's Fallout game, if they are able to keep that within scope, which they were not able to do with Avowed. And maybe you're going to get Machine Games' Wolfenstein game, if that's what Machine Games is working on. But all the other stuff, right, none of that is coming out in 2027 and 2028. And so what you're going to get largely from Xbox first party in 2027 and 2028 is what I said, right? Is you're going to get DLC, remasters, and live service updates for that part of their portfolio. None of this means Xbox cannot recover. History is filled with companies that reinvented themselves after periods of profound strategic failure. But successful turnarounds are not built upon optimistic messaging alone. They are built upon measurable operational improvement. Over the next 12 months, I will be watching for evidence that Xbox has embraced stronger governance, stabilized its software pipeline, improved monetization without eroding customer trust, and begin translating player engagement into durable financial performance. Until those indicators begin moving together, I remain unconvinced that a return to meaningful growth by the end of FY27 is supported by the evidence currently available. Hope is an important leadership quality. Execution is what ultimately appears on the balance sheet. And execution is what Xbox has had a problem with for the last decade and a half. Return to profitability, return to growth in 12 months when your pipeline is 4 games, one of which isn't performing well, 2 of which are going to be exclusives that are going on to the smallest install base in the market. Like, none of that equates to a return to growth and a return to profitability. Like, I just think that's, like, it's a wildly farcical assertion. Adding 200 million players while you're, like, all of your financial indicators are negative. Literally every one of your financial indicators is negative. Like, again, so, jeez Louise, sorry. Hold on. So again, this is why I listen to this stuff and I hear what's coming out of the mouths, right? And I'm like, none of this passes the smell test, right? With any type of objectiveness or evidentiary look at what's going on. And here's another key indicator, right, of the MacGuffining that is being tossed around. Call of Duty makes more money than the MCU. Like, unless you're looking at, like, some 3-month period where no MCU movie came out, or you're looking at a really bad year, like, that's a totally ludicrous assertion. Call of Duty has been around for 22 years. It has made roughly about $31.5 billion. The MCU has been around for 18 years. It has made about $34.5 billion. And that is just the films. That is not including all of the merchandising. That is not including the movie tie-in comic books. That is not including, the impact on the video service. I mean, like Great Scott, like, The entire Disney Plus video streaming service was launched on the strength of the MCU. All of the content that is in the Disney streaming service largely was held by Disney, right, before the MCU became a big thing. It was because the MCU became a big thing that Disney felt it to finally hit the inflection point where it warranted having its own video streaming service. And then, on top of that, that is if I don't include all the things that they own now. Hold on, this filter's driving me nuts. Okay, it's still off kilter, but yeah, fine. But that's if I don't include all the things that they own now. The X-Men franchise has generated about $7.5 billion when you talk about the primary X-Men movies, the Deadpool movies, and the standalone Wolverine movies. The Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, the 3 Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies and the 2 Andrew Garfield movies made about, I think, $4.5 billion, maybe $3.5 billion. $3.5 billion. That before Spider-Man started being incorporated into the MCU. Now, right? So the revenue that the Spider-Man movies are making now, obviously not all going into the MCU pocket, right? Obviously split with Sony, but still, right? That's a significant amount of revenue. Then the Fantastic Four movies, which they now own, if those were included in the greater aggregate revenue definition of the MCU, those movies have made just north of maybe $1 billion. So my point is that the MCU has been around for less time, has made more money, and so if I average how much revenue they make each year, it clearly comes up quantifiably greater in total than the amount Call of Duty has earned over its 22-year existence. So again, unless you're saying, hey, in the early years of Call of Duty, it wasn't making that much, and then you apply this acceleration factor where in the last 10 years, they've made incredibly more money. And so you look at that isolated period of time, right? But again, unless you're cooking the books with that assertion, the assertion is ludicrous, right? That she stated. And so again, there's all this smoke and mirrors that goes on about the definition of where the business is and what the business potential has that does not realistically indicate where the business can go and how much time it is going to take. There's no way that the business turns around in 12 months. Absolutely no way. And you're not introducing a new console, and your consoles that you have on the market are priced what they are, and you've said that component prices are going to go up. Unless Microsoft is just planning on taking their AI money and just eating a crap ton of Xbox costs and subsidizing those consoles, which Satya Nadella has said he's not going to do, or takes a bunch of that money and puts it back into Game Pass and starts subsidizing the service like they did in the early years of Game Pass, which again, Satya Nadella has asserted he's not going to do. It's a totally ridiculous statement to say that the business is going to turn around in 12 months. I can't, I don't know. I have to go back to maybe BlackBerry with some of the crazy things that Lazaridis used to say when when RIM was getting their butts kicked by the iPhone. I think I have to go back, that is a total CEO no he didn't type statement, right? So again, painting these things and encapsulating them in objective financial mathematical reality to contrast them with the positive PR optimism hopium, right, or hope that they're trying to convey, just to make sure people take them into consideration with some of that reality. Hey, Josh Harris, thanks so much for coming through. I appreciate it. Josh Harris, it's bad if you add 200 million users but still can't get profitable. You're in deep trouble. Here at NR, I signed up for WandaVision. And I left 2 years later due to the decline in quality. Josh Harris says it has to be just hope so shareholders don't throw them away. BlackBerry, it doesn't even have a keyboard. Yeah, look, Lazaridis, and I always forget his partner's name, so I just always pin it on Lazaridis. But it was he and his partner who were just didn't take the iPhone seriously until it was too late. And so again, I'll dovetail this back, right? Because this brings up the case study or the inference that I was going to try to point to today. about this conversation that we've been having about physical versus digital. The things I say are not because I'm against, right, the people who support physical. And even though I often use the phrase, I have empathy for you, but I feel empathetic for you, but I don't feel sympathetic. There are things that also I have been passionate about, obviously, that I've lost, right? So I huge BlackBerry stan. I actually worked overseas, and I actually negotiated, right, the contract with Vodafone to get us BlackBerries because I wanted a BlackBerry so bad. And then I negotiated a deal where not only did we get them for the company, but we got discounts for people who then wanted to buy their personal ones. So I think this was the first time in my life that I became a dual phone wielder, and this kind of preceded my time as a smartphone reviewer, as my side hustle, but as a big BlackBerry stan. And so when the physical keyboard went away, again, I felt the same way. And again, I felt kind of the same thing. Like, hey, despite how small the market share is, like, there's still, like, those of us who are willing to buy a physical keyboard phone, and so BlackBerry should continue making them. Same thing when the Zune went under. Same thing when the Microsoft Band went under. Same thing when Sega went under, right? So all these times throughout all history, these decades of things that I loved in electronics, I have also lost these things. And media types, right, that I've liked. Like, I often give Sony guff about all of its proprietary media types because I hated them and they were pains in the butt. But quite honestly, like, there's a certain point when you have to buy them. And so once you buy them, like, I thought UMDs were ridiculous, but I built up a collection of UMDs, right? Because I just got with the program. Zip drives and all these other, like, and these things got abandoned, right? But all along the way, I always acknowledged when there were things that I wanted where I was a minority of the market, and the business case didn't necessarily make sense to continue that. And so, again, it's not that I'm not empathetic to you guys who feel like you're losing something. I am absolutely empathetic, and I get it, right? Because I've lost those things too. I've lost consoles that I've been invested in. I've lost, Android handsets. Like, again, big smartphone guy, right? I was a big consumer at the time when LG made handsets and Sony made more than one Xperia model, and Great Scott, HTC made handsets, and the Google Nexus program, right? All these were phones, because I used to keep like a bunch of smartphones around, because again, I was a reviewer, but I also just was a big phone guy. I'm still a big phone guy, but I had all of these things, and like, definitely saddened when LG decided to stop making phones. Definitely saddened when Lenovo temporarily came into the space and then pulled back. Asus made more phones than it makes now. Acer made phones, but all these guys decided to retract, and so there were things that I lost. I was as you guys know, a huge purveyor, consumer of Windows phones, right? I had half dozen Windows phones. I would constantly like hawk the things on Amazon and eBay and look for used ones, because people were selling them because Microsoft didn't have market share, so there were always cheap ones you could pick up, and I loved Windows phones. I literally had a collection so that I could pick a different one up every day and walk out the door with it as my daily driver. But there was a very sad, like slowly decaying toil of, Microsoft getting out of that, because they didn't have the traction that made it a viable business to go forward. And all along the way, right, with each of those things, I had arguments, or other people would have arguments. Well, but it's a good enough percentage. It's enough of a market share, blah 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 blah, and those things went away. So, again, the things that I say is not about me being against you guys. It's where I lose the ability to have a grounded conversation is when, first of all, there's causalities associated with it that are just not real, right? They're just not researched. They're not founded. They're not based on anything. It drives me kind of nuts, not nuts, but I can't understand it, that all of a sudden we're believing what Alana Pierce says, like in a very casual one-liner that she throws out because she heard it from another influencer. when just 3 months ago, 4 months ago, 6 months ago, whatever it was, we were trying to cancel her because there was questions about the credibility of her contributions while she was at Sony Santa Monica. But now all of a sudden she throws out that, this plant in Thalgau is being entirely converted over for the purpose of producing optical micro lenses, entirely exclusively for the purposes of AI data centers, which it's not. And she doesn't have any evidence or corroboration or metrics or anything to like back up that assertion. If you want to believe that they're being entirely built for AI data centers, that's fine. But you basing it on an assertion by Alana, that's just weird to me. When, like I said, people were trying to cancel her a few months ago. So again, whatever. Like I understand that people are upset. I understand that there's a thing that people want. I understand that people are losing a thing. I'm just trying to ground my part of the conversation because I didn't do this for 2 weeks because I felt like you couldn't have a conversation without addressing it. But I think the reality is I'm not going to be able to continue doing the show unless I address it when it comes up. And what I will say is my effort to address it, like everything, is to orient it around objective, evidentiary, grounded understandings of the business and like the way I myself would perceive it. If I were making those decisions at the business, not necessarily like how I would approach it as a gamer or how I feel about it as a gamer, or absent from my own experiences in history, because I can't do that, right? I can't be like some other content creators and influencers who they do a podcast and they're completely different people, right? Then or they act as if again, like the whole corporate greed thing, right? They act as if they don't have a day job. Like where do your raises come from? They come out of profit. How do you get more raises next year? We raise prices. Your job's hard. You don't have enough people. Where do new hires come from? They come out of profit. They come out of things that we earn in excess of cost of goods sold. So I just don't have the ability to act like that's not the way the world functions or how capitalism functions. Like some other content creators do. So sorry, that's my rant. That's my diatribe. We have definitely been on here too long. I have again gone for 2 hours and I did not intend to. Sorry, Hero. I did not mean to make it hurt by bringing it up again. Marwana, I prefer honesty over someone trying to pander to my emotions. And yes, there's a lot of pandering that goes on in the space. They're talking about Alana. I do my best to avoid all her content. She was the villain. Josh says, Sony have said old games will still have prints, so not everything is being converted clearly. Hero to enter. I won't be caught pants down with physical games that may be worthless in a year. Yeah, I mean, that's a consideration that has to be made, not just about physical media, but about everything. Like I say this about like Xbox and this uncertainty that clouds it. Like the decision you have to make is whether or not you're going to continue to invest money in a thing where you're not convinced of its longevity or where it's going. And again, this as much as I was a diehard Sega stan, but when things got shaky and I became unconvinced that they were going to stick with it, like even during the Sega Saturn, that's when I became a PlayStation player, is when I took my Sega Saturn in and traded it in to get a PlayStation. And lo and behold, within months of me making that decision, Sega made the announcement that they were no longer continuing to support the Sega Saturn. And again, if you don't remember, there was a gap between them making that announcement and then them saying they were working on the Dreamcast. A little bit of a gap. They said they were going to stop supporting it so that they could pay attention to the next generation thing, but then they didn't talk about the next generation thing for a while, so there was no guarantee that they were making the Dreamcast. And when the Dreamcast came back, I onboarded back into the Sega ecosystem, but I did it with the clarity that like, hey, I don't know if this is going to continue to be a thing, so I know I'm acknowledging that I'm spending this money and there may not be any longevity here, but like the decisions you're making, hopefully theoretically, are somehow bound in what you have right for a long-term outlook, or what are somehow bound by what you expect of your ROI, right, to be on anything that you're going to make purchases of. I predict in 3 years that people will move on from physical games very quickly. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, and I don't say this statement because I'm against, but I can't remember a statement that somebody said. It was something about, I think somebody somewhere I said, but it's clear that PlayStation is ignoring, PlayStation is ignoring our outcry and thinks that people are just gonna continue buying PlayStation stuff and we'll just ignore it. I'm like, they don't expect that the 20% of you that spend 5%, right, of their revenue, they fully acknowledge you guys may decide that you're done with the platform, and that's quite honestly what I would expect, and quite honestly what I would recommend. Like, if you are so hateful about this decision that PlayStation has made, you should be deplatforming. You should be going again, people need to make their decisions, but a thing that I don't stay on a platform where I'm not convinced of its longevity. When I've been on platforms and they say we're going to continue doing this thing for X months or X years, but there's no after this, I don't wait. I don't if I were angry about this physical media thing, I would not be sticking around for 18 months. I would take my PlayStation in. I would trade it in. I would trade in my I guess I would trade in my physical games so I wouldn't have anything to play it on, right? But I would deplatform and I would I would take that money and I would go invest it somewhere else with longevity. And my feeling is, I just don't know the people who are not doing that. I just don't know. I just don't know that some percentage of those people are saying now they're angry with Sony and they're not going to buy a PlayStation 6, but some percentage of those people are going to continue paying into the PlayStation ecosystem. It's not zero. They're not all keeping their PlayStations and keeping all their games and are going to follow through on any notion of a commitment that they're never spending money in the PlayStation ecosystem ever again. It's just not a realistic projection. I'm not saying some of them won't. I'm saying that some will, and it's not zero. So again, it's difficult for me to sift through the veracity of just where's the outrage, credible, valid, and where is there going to be follow through. But at the end of the day, I would when a platform pisses me off, I deplatform and I go somewhere else. That's just me. I don't stick around. Here at Enter, I moved on from Lumia 3 months before Microsoft announced the end. We have to be smart enough to know when to leave. If you're not, Josh, agree if you're not happy, move, it's okay to leave. T-Rock, thanks so much, T-Rock, for coming through. I appreciate it. I'm certainly not deserved of you coming through, but thanks so much that you did. T-Rock says, if people think Sony didn't anticipate the blowback and already have projected outcomes post-announcement, still have their mom doing the laundry. Come on, T-Rock. Hero Detonator, I won't, but like I said, I'll get a PC to de-risk. Yeah, and I totally understand that, Hero. Awara says, I can't do that for 2 reasons. I have 2 PS5s. They are both used by the family, my partner and 3 kids. I'd be selfish to trade them in. Also, I have had someone tell me there's a chance, I think he's saying that there's a chance that Sony is going to walk it back. So yeah, Awara, I totally understand that. I was definitely at a point, at a point where I got rid of my consoles. I got rid of my PlayStation and my Xbox. I actually kept my Nintendo Switch at the time for that reason, only because I had other people in the household who I thought would play it. They wound up not playing it, or actually they wound up playing it for a little bit, and I had to take it away. So I get that. That Sony is making a new physical media. I'm taking that with a grain of salt. However, they knew of the Sony canceling discs the day before it was announced. I'll leave it there. Sony won't walk it back, but PS6 will have a disc drive for PS5 games. Yeah, I believe that too, Hero. Well, I believe that they'll either sell a peripheral, or, and I think this would actually be what would be smart. I think what would be smart would be for them to just say, because it's an x86 platform, we're rolling our own driver for USB external Blu-ray drives, and stop this whole thing of like we're going to make a proprietary drive to it. Just make it a unit. Just make it so people can go buy a $10 or $15 USB external Blu-ray drive, and that the PlayStation 6 will accommodate that and use it. That is the smartest thing in the world for them to do, in my opinion. That gets them out of the investment and the cost of coming up with the design, doing the maintenance for the firmware, and all this crap about like a proprietary external drive. A proprietary external drive makes 0 sense to me. 0 cents. And yeah, where I wouldn't be surprised if they came up with a new proprietary physical media, because this is the company that made UMDs and Memory Stick and Betamax. Sony loves their proprietary physical media, so it wouldn't absolutely surprise me. And because I think, just if you kind of look back through the history, right, of optical media, right, when CD was kind of superseded by DVD, even though, like, this is the thing that's kind of interesting to think about, right, is the fact that DVD came along and music didn't switch to DVD because DVD was just bigger than the needs of CD. So music went straight from CD straight to digital because that's what makes sense for its evolution. DVD, which was mostly movies and games, went to Blu-ray, and movies and games followed suit. But if PlayStation, because I think Blu-ray from a capacity standpoint is kind of reaching a point where it does need to shift. People need, like, if people are going to continue physical media, they need bigger physical media. And so part of this too is like where it makes sense, right? Blu-ray is starting to hit some limiters with the sizes of certain games, and that's why you see other things that people are pissed off about, like the fact that the entire game isn't on the disc. Well, everybody's kind of shrugging their shoulders and saying, hey, the next thing bigger than a Blu-ray is a freaking SSD. We're not going to ship games on SSDs, right? So there is room for there to be like new physical media that goes up to, I don't know, 200 gigabytes, 300 gigabytes, I don't know. But then what I expect is that the interesting thing will be, I suspect that only games will make that move. My point is that I think movies will do the same thing music did, and they'll say, we don't need 300 gigabytes for movies, 200 gigabytes for movies. We're just going to drop DVDs and just go all digital, right? So maybe there will be another physical media. But again, I would still emphasize for people who felt that they were caught off guard, burned, right, who always thought game physical media would go away, but it wouldn't be now, like it would be later. I would just say, okay, like if they do another physical media format, that is probably your last time, right? Given that, right, we upped physical media 2 times before, music dropped off. We upped physical media 1 time before, and now movies dropped. And movies will probably drop off. So if we update physical, right, we do physical media, one media is going to go to that, one content type is going to go to that, and that will probably be the last one, I would suspect. T-Rex says, I have a 17, almost 18-year-old son. When he saw Sony's announcement, his reaction, people still buy discs. Not evidence of anything other than his perception of the gaming world. It surprised me. Warren says, the person who told me they expect Sony to reveal a new physical media, not discs. New Sony was about to announce the canceling of discs, and they told me the day before the announcement. Right. Reworded to make it clear. Josh, yeah, games don't fit on Blu-rays, so they need to move on. Yep. Micro SSDs. Yeah, I don't know, man. It's going to be weird. I mean, because the main problem with, like, whatever they do for physical media will probably be something Flash, right, oriented. And those things have to be fast, right, for games. Now the challenge is like they're not going to be delivery mechanisms, right? Solely, they're gonna install the installation executable, but they'll have assets on them, and you need those assets unpacked. You're gonna, I guess you won't install to them. You'll still install from them to the SSD. So there is, like, they maybe don't need to be that performant. My point is that they don't need to be as performant as SSDs. So look, I don't know. Maybe I've often talked about this from the GameStop perspective, GameStop was always, has been, their consoles are growing digital media. Why should we continue to sell it? It's like, what GameStop should do is they should sell like 1 terabyte thumb drives, and they should have kiosks that allow people to come in and like take their 1 terabyte thumb drive and download a game, and maybe work with the platform vendors that's an acceptable like delivery path for people to download games who are bandwidth challenged at home. So I don't know. The micro SSDs doesn't sound like a horrible notion, Josh. Wara says, I understand physical is going away, but I will always continue to use it while it's available. Just as they don't need to be fast. You won't play off them. Sony Cell Stick for games. PS3 processor throwback. Yeah, PS3 on a thumb drive, right? Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for coming through. I appreciate the time. The reason the podcast went for 2 hours instead of an hour and a half, I had about an hour and a half of content prepared. The conversation drove it to be 30 minutes, so I appreciate you guys coming through and participating. I will figure out, how to wire one of these for next week. I think I will be getting back to it. I'm just going to have to figure out how to, tiptoe around some of these topics. But maybe next week we'll have some pleasant things to talk about, and we won't have to talk about anything unpleasant or anything that pisses people off. Thanks so much for coming through. For anybody who happens to watch the archive version of this live stream, I appreciate you. Please feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you can just receive a notification whenever I post new content. I just do not with certainty remember the names of everybody who came through the live stream. I appreciate you. You guys know I appreciate you. I appreciate you, Hero Down Under, Warawana, Josh Ayers, Dryad Chisel, D Hope, E-Nate, Priscilla, T-Rock especially. I appreciate you coming through. I appreciate everybody who came through. So please feel free to join me next time. Again, keep an eye on the YouTube page, and I guess my Blue Sky, if you happen to be there, to see when I'm going to do one of these next week. So until next time, take care of yourselves, stay safe out there, play the games that you like, come here to talk to me about the games that you love. Once again, my name has been Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, one of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going weekly video games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube. That show goes down Sunday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on the E2KG Network. Did I say the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube? So yeah, I think that's it. Until next time, that's going to do it for me. Good night, good luck, and good gaming. Thanks so much for coming through. I will see you guys around. So thanks so much. I'll talk to you guys later. I'm out of here.
Stop at New Apollos. Cop a Henny sour, and I'm puffing Jack sour. Yeah, I feel a black power. Yeah, this time is really ours. It's time to get the bag. Yeah, it's time to get the bag. Yeah. Dollars coming, let me see it. Multi-million, I'm a bid. On the mission, best believe it. Ask for it, you receive it. Dollars coming, let me see it. Multi-million, I'm a bid. On the mission, best believe it. Ask for it, you receive it. Ask for it, you receive it. Got it locked, put the key in. Got them looking, yeah, they praying. She like, I like what I'm seeing. Now we up, they agreeing, play full, yeah, we eating. Now you can't ignore this feeling when you got it from him seeing. Why these built in? You find love, why you cheating? She know that I'm never leaving. They want beef, but they vegan. I don't know why they on that. Get a pack, then I roll that. She got, tell her throw that, start her on, it's a throwback. Just a straight roll, I don't even pay tolls. The boy a genius and I ain't talking yay though. Been a living legend since I was like a